bad thing because it uses violence and you would use math in place of it, or that it could actually be used to facilitate violence by, using, let's say, prediction markets or something else to induce people to commit crimes, where the committer of violence has unusual information about where the violence will be committed and therefore can profit from it.
It's definitely a worry that I and lots of people in the crypto space have had since the beginning. Though I do feel like at least so far I've been surprised. It feels like less of it has happened than we had expected.
That's the thing.
Yeah.
Now, what accounts for the idea that something that can be dreamt has mostly not occurred?
And I definitely have a...
maybe it's a great thing about humans that we didn't realize that we're not nearly the horrible people we thought we were.
Yeah, and I definitely have a couple of theories about this. So one of those theories is that, basically a lot of things that people do, and especially a lot of things that people do in the infosphere, because public goods are kind of chronically underfunded and all that, rely really heavily on goodwill. And so you have goodwill that if you pay someone to write some piece of software for your website, it's not going to include some
malicious code.
Yeah, some bug that'll steal people's money or tell the FBI where you are. If you create a system for enforcing agreements that they'll actually get enforced, then even on internet forums, they depend on kind of a lot of volunteer labor for just things like moderation. And if you create a group that just goes fundamentally against the vast majority of people's values, then it's just going to be hard to find volunteer effort for that sort of thing. And that's probably the big reason, I think, why so far we don't really see kind of complicated decentralized structures being created to facilitate black markets for killing people and so forth. Because
let's start off with something more mundane, like a numbers racket.
Right.
So a numbers racket would probably be a much simpler application.
So what do you mean by numbers racket here?
Well, it's something that takes the place of a lottery, where let's say some naturally occurring number that would be printed in a newspaper, and presumably nobody has the influence over what number gets printed.
Right.
Constitutes the lotto draw.
Yeah, lotteries have existed on blockchain since the beginning.
Yeah.
Even there's definitely been this kind of sub-community of people that created these kind of provably fair Ponzi contracts where you have a smart contract and you can throw money in, and as soon if you're the nth person to throw money in, as soon as two n people throw money in, you get 1.9 back or something like that. And this is just a fun game that people have made and participated in, even fully knowing what the economics of the thing are. So yeah, and things like that have definitely happened, though I don't gambling is the sort of thing that there isn't this kind of 99% plus consensus that it's really horrible and evil, right? Because on the one hand, lots of people want to ban it, but on the other hand, people do it. And it's something that people see negative consequences of, but at the same time, it is something that people participate in and enjoy. Whereas the extremely bad stuff, there's definitely this kind of barrier between kind of things that are edgy versus things that are just so far over the edge. And for things that are kind of so far over the edge, it is even with smart contracts and even with all of those things, it's still hard to coordinate those structures. And I think the blockchain's inability to directly read facts about the real world could even be a saving grace here, because a blockchain can't directly read whether or not something in the real world happened. It basically means that if you want to have some application, whether a prediction market or something else that does,
so can we say a little bit more about the intellectual problem that you're touching?
Sure.
So the idea is that there may be something that's very perceptible to us about the real world. But we might naively think, well, the computer should be able to tell whether that happened
right,
or it didn't happen, and that's a surprisingly difficult thing to code up reliably so that the interface between the world of bits and bytes and the world of otherwise physical reality, which often we don't realize we're thinking about subjectively, that it's hard to maintain that interface so that the way in which the things that have happened in the real world can be definitely agreed upon without any kind of adjudication inside of the digital world.
Right. Yeah. So
I don't know how to say that well.
Blockchains are kind of fundamentally programmatic medium. All they see is like data that gets fed into them and what they can compute as a result of that data. And so if you want to create a smart contract that says, if someone figures out what the prime factors of a big number are, pay them a reward, you can do that because prime factors are something that you can multiply together and verify. But if you want to have a smart contract that says, if there's a hurricane in Sri Lanka, then pay $500, then like you can't do that on the blockchain itself. Because like computer code has no idea what hurricanes are. It has no idea what Sri Lanka is.
No, but it could, in that case, you could have a designation that that the national
correct. You can get data from third-party sources, and this is the thing that
somebody else turns it into data.
Exactly. This is the thing that a lot of applications are doing. But the thing that's important to keep in mind is that as soon as you do that, like your smart contract is no longer fully trustless.
Right.
Right.
So there's this concept, which is like a utopian concept of a trustless legal system, so that you don't have the messiness of humans anywhere in the system, and you can have complete faith and confidence in the contract that you've struck.
Yeah, right. And like outside of basically giving bounties for solving math problems, like it's not something that you can 100% achieve.
So I can't necessarily insure my vacation that if I go all the way to Argentina and the weather is terrible, it pays out because we can't agree what terrible weather is.
Right. Like you can create structures made out of individual participants that can try to kind of align incentives to get people to kind of give correct results. Like you can have complicated kind of contraptions involving people giving different answers and policing each other and rewarding people who give the same answer that other people have committed to and things like this. But like you can only try to approach the ideal of kind of correct truth. Like you can never 100% reach it.
Now you started Ethereum in 2014, 2015?
Started end of 2013. I mean, it launched in 2015.
Okay. Would you say, let's use launch date as an artificial date. Would you say you are more or less excited emotionally than you were when it started? You've now been through, you've logged some miles here.
Definitely excited.
More excited.
I think the main difference is kind of more definitely kind of excited in the sense of like 4 years. Well, definite kind of as opposed to indefinite. Right? Like 4 years, 4 years ago it was about like, hey, let's make this platform to kind of try a bunch of really cool things. We have no idea what's going to happen, and let's just stick it out there. And now, like, we know things about things that people are already doing. We know things about things that people wants to do, and we also know more about like what the limitations are. And so instead of just being this kind of extremely fuzzy dream of like, let's stick smart contracts and algorithms and kind of trustlessify everything,
right? It's
something that's kind of both more moderate, but also kind of more like seeming much more like it actually has a big chance of kind of transforming the world, kind of precisely because it's kind of moderated to some extent.
So are you more, if I gave you a false three choices, and by the way, smart people always hate these things, so feel free to break the model. If I gave you a choice between saying, are you mostly excited about the technology and the amount of innovation? Are you mostly excited about the business opportunities for yourself? Or are you mostly excited about the way in which this could transform human life? Would that be an easy call? Or would you say, I reject that decision tree?
Some mix of the first and the third. I don't know. I guess like the framing of business opportunities is definitely kind of never like, this is weird. I mean, despite kind of even...
I get the sense that you don't love money enough.
Yeah, this is true.
Okay.
I mean, it's weird because for a long time...
You have a lot of it.
Yeah, well, I have a lot of it, and it's also even weirder because like for a long time I subscribed to this kind of branch of economics that basically says that like love of money is like the best motivation for people to have. And
sort of
like,
an Ayn Randian?
Well, I'd say like in that area, but
But I don't get that. I'll be honest. I just don't get that vibe.
Right. I mean, I've definitely kind of shifted a lot over the years. I think like my experience even within the crypto space itself has kind of given me a lot of new information to work with.
Say more.
Like basically, and this goes back to this kind of cryptocurrencies as a kind of microcosm of wider society thing, right? Like, if you're like basically any movement, regardless of like what the movement is for or what its goals are, to be succeed, it needs to be sufficiently big. And once something is sufficiently big, it needs to have internal structure to coordinate and achieve its objectives, which means that it suffers from governance issues, it suffers from public goods issues, it suffers from conflicts with adjacent movements, it suffers from conflicts between its own values and its own desire to succeed, and so on and so forth. And like it needs to come up with ways to answer like basically almost the same kinds of hard problems that the world as a whole is working on.
Well, you know, it's interesting. When I look at this sort of world of people, maybe it had an epicenter in the Bay Area, though I think it's less true now, who are trying to figure out what is the future and how do we get there. There's a very clear sense that people's creativity and their intelligence is correlated with their financial success, but it's not very tight. And so there's like an embarrassment that, well, that person is super amazing and they're not doing all that well. This person somehow metabolized a tremendous amount.
This is something that I've definitely kind of realized just from kind of my travels. Like I've interacted with a lot of kind of super famous people in different kinds of positions, which includes like some world leaders and includes some kind of leaders of like fields in cryptography. And you realize that like people in these positions, they are impressive, but they're not like super amazing, godlike impressive, right?
Some of them are.
Some of them are, but then there's also super amazing, godlike impressive people that just like don't get that much recognition at all.
That's sort of what I'm trying to get at. Is that if I think about, like, if you hang around with musicians, very often you'll have somebody who's a super famous musician and say, you want to know who's really good? And they'll tell you somebody you've never heard of. You say, well, that person's a musician's musician.
Exactly this, yes.
Right. And so, you know, if I gave the name of people who are famous for being, let's say, physicists, they're very often the people on television as physicists, but they would all point to some guy who doesn't give a lot of interviews and say, well, that's the top guy in the field.
Exactly. Like basically, like social status like is predicted by competence multiplied by like basically publicity skill, and that's half correlated with competence for obvious reasons.
Right.
But like those people also know the people that have the real competence.
And that's one of the things that I've always found really interesting about people who have this diehard belief that markets produce justice, which is, I do think that success in markets is somewhat correlated or has been with things like productivity, but it's also correlated sometimes with how predatory somebody can be or how lucky they happen to be at a particular moment. And one of the questions that I have is, if you're really interested in innovation, which is what I sort of pick up is one of the main things, how does something like Ethereum give us a possibility to revitalize innovation after what many of us consider a period of relative stagnancy outside of the areas of computation and communication, which everybody knows have exploded? Do you think about how Ethereum can mediate a new renaissance, a new generative age? You sort of talked about it a little bit.
Definitely. And I think there's kind of Ethereum as a platform for experiments in governance and public goods funding is one thing I mentioned. And education is another thing that I kind of talk about and obviously do. I mean, I have a lot of these blog posts on Vitalik.ca and other forums. And like one of the big challenges that, for example, is that like for in kind of internet educational resources in general, there's basically two kinds, right? There's like papers and Wikipedia and like basically things that are technically accurate, but they're just like horribly not understandable at all, and we should not be forcing people to even try reading them. And then there's pop-sci literature, which is very accessible, but it's often just actively wrong in really horrible ways. And like I personally, even before Ethereum, like I did Bitcoin Magazine, for example, like I've always tried to find this kind of middle gap, this way to explain, take concepts that are technical and expand them to a broader audience so that they are more accessible. And like this to me has been important in part because like I view accessibility of information about the technology as a precondition for even the decentralization of the space. Like if the thing technically runs on 50,000 computers, but only 42 people know how it works, then your decentralization index isn't 50,000, it's 42. And so...
That's a very nice point.
Yeah, and so trying to kind of improve even how we in the Ethereum community kind of work on innovation internally. But so those are kind of things that happen in blockchains as a lab for trying out new things, kind of first for the blockchain space and then potentially export it to other things. And then we can also look at kind of blockchains as something that can be used to improve and create better institutions. So like one of the Ethereum Foundation's researchers, Vlad Zamfir, he actually got into Ethereum because he was looking at how to improve academic publishing. And like he saw things like, the existing peer review mechanisms and how they were just very flawed in a bunch of ways. And he thought that like, hey, here's potentially a platform that we could use to like build something that does better. And like that's one of his